Welcome. If you're here for the breakdown of The Silent City, The Severed Echo, Episode 4, and since I publish new content every 2 to 3 days, you absolutely need to tap the subscribe button and the bell icon right now. That way, you won't miss a single video in our sequence. Ready? Let's get into it. Themselves as if history were rehearsing. A voice emerged, mechanical yet intimate, as though the core itself were speaking directly into the folds of her thoughts. Rewrite in progress. Anchoring primary consciousness. Choose your axis. Lina's breath caught. The question wasn't metaphoric. The core demanded a foundation point, a single emotional truth that would determine how the new reality arranged itself. Kale's face flickered before her, then multiplied into countless versions of him. Alive, lost, corrupted, victorious. She tried to grab one, but her hands passed through. Axis, Kale, she whispered. The void shuddered. Something enormous, like a celestial engine, locked into place. A shockwave rippled outward, stitching the fractured timelines into a singular trajectory. Lina slammed into solid ground. She gasped, staggering to her feet. She stood in an unfamiliar city at dusk, illuminated by soft neon and drifting ash-like particles that glittered as they fell in reverse. The sky overhead churned with serpentine streaks of pale data, as if the atmosphere itself was processing. People walked by, unaware that their world had just been rewritten, yet each passerby flickered with faint static, unfinished lines of existence still synchronizing. Lina's heartbeat accelerated. This wasn't her world. It wasn't any world she knew. But she felt Kale's presence, not a memory, not a ghost, but a living signal somewhere in this new architecture. She turned toward the feeling just as an announcement echoed through the streets from unseen speakers. Directive network reboot complete. Divergent anomaly detected. Subject LO1. Location confirmed. Lina froze. The system remembered her. A drone formation unfolded from the clouds, scanning beams cutting through the dust. She clenched her fists, sensing the glyphs echo embedded beneath her skin. Altered, rewritten with her. If this world wants to find me, she muttered, it'll have to keep up. And she ran into the neon twilight of the newborn timeline. Lina sprinted through the neon-veined streets as the rewritten city folded and unfolded around her in subtle glitches, as if reality were buffering her presence. The drone sliced through the dusk behind her, scanning beams skittering across mirrored windows and casting warped reflections of her shifting silhouette. She felt the core's residual imprint vibrating beneath her skin, a pulsing reminder that she no longer belonged to any single timeline. As she wove through an alley where walls flickered between brick and translucent data columns, whispered fragments drifted through the air, echoes of people sinking into their new existence, words repeating and correcting themselves like a corrupted chorus. Lina paused, catching her breath, when suddenly a ripple of distortion expanded across the ground. A pale holographic aperture unfurled before her, shimmering with uncertainty. The voice returned, calm, mechanical, but threaded with something almost aware. Subject LO1. Divergence rate increasing. Relink recommended. Lina stepped back. No, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. You rewrote the world. You don't get to rewrite me. The aperture shuddered, contracting into a narrow beam of scanning light that crawled up her body. Her glyph ignited beneath her skin, responding instinctively. A shockwave burst outward, short-circuiting the scan and fracturing the alley into jagged visual errors. Lina seized the opening and ran again. She emerged onto a wide plaza bathed in violet glow, surrounded by monolithic screens cycling through cryptic system logs. Citizens moved through the space with deliberate steps, too precise, too synchronized, like dancers in a pre-scripted routine. Then she felt it. A jolt. A pull. Kale. His signal resonated through the city's ambient hum like a tuning fork struck in the distance. She turned sharply, following the invisible thread leading northward through the tightening grid of streets. But as she approached a towering transit spire, a massive projection flickered to life above it. A faceless geometric mask formed from intersecting lines, the Sentinel, but altered, adapted to the new rewrite. Its voice boomed across the city, deeper than before, layered with static. Anomaly LO1 has breached containment parameters. All directive units, converge. The crowd didn't panic. They simply shifted, their synchronized steps accelerating as if updated instructions had been silently transmitted to every mind. Lina ducked beneath a descending scan field, leapt across a gap in the pavement where geometry hadn't fully solidified yet, and bolted into the lower transit tunnels. Darkness embraced her, warm, dense, alive with a low mechanical resonance. Lights flickered, and from the shadows, a small drone, sleeker than the others, lifted into view, tilting its head-like frame at her. But instead of red pursuit lights, it pulsed with soft blue. A familiar signal emanated from it, fragile, encoded, but unmistakable. Kale's frequency. The drone projected a single line of text into the air. Lina, don't run. I found a way through. Her heartbeat stopped, then thundered. She stepped closer. Kale, where are you? The tunnel rumbled as something vast descended from above. The drone dimmed, flickering under interference, and its projection changed. Hurry. They're rewriting again. The ground trembled violently. Lina reached out for the drone, just as the world around her fractured into cascading static. The world dissolved into cascading static as Lina stumbled forward, grasping at the flickering drone before the tunnel reality shattered like glass around her. She felt the rewrite surge, a violent sweeping pressure, as if an unseen hand were dragging the entire city into alignment with new parameters. The air turned thin and electric. Sparks of luminous data spiraled upward, outlining fractured silhouettes of half-formed structures. Lina's knees buckled, but the drone steadied itself mid-air, its blue glow struggling against the whiteout. Lina, hold on. Kale's voice burst through in fragmented bursts, each syllable stuttering through layers of interference. She reached toward the source, but reality snapped sideways before her fingers connected. Suddenly she was somewhere else, standing on a suspended walkway high above the city. Though the sky had no texture, only shifting bands of code flowing like storm clouds. The buildings below oscillated, deforming and re-rendering, their foundations rewriting faster than her eyes could track. This isn't a relocation, she whispered. It's a full overwrite. Simultaneously, the walkway trembled beneath her feet. A cascade of red warnings rippled across the sky like digital lightning, and a colossal silhouette emerged from the hovering code storm. The new Sentinel, but expanded, now a massive geometrical titan with hundreds of shifting vector plates orbiting its core. Its voice thundered through the rewrite haze. Subject LO1. Isolation breach confirmed. System override engaged. Lina's glyph flared hot against her wrist, responding to the destabilization around her. She gritted her teeth as the walkway fragmented into floating hexagonal tiles. She leapt from one to another while the Sentinel sent down slicing beams of scanning light that trailed after her like hunting blades. Mid-air, she spotted a distortion field forming ahead, an unstable pocket where old and new versions of the city collided in a haze of glitch shards. She propelled herself toward it, landing hard inside the pulsing anomaly. For an instant, sound muted, and she felt Kale's signal again. Clearer this time. Lina, I found a breach in the rewrite protocol. It's pulling you toward the fracture point. Don't resist it. She exhaled sharply. I'm done letting the system pull me anywhere. Yet the ground beneath her shifted, rippling like a living surface, and suddenly she was dragged downward into a lower plane of the anomaly. There, within the shimmering distortions, she saw something impossible. Overlapping versions of the transit tunnels, the plaza, the old skyline, layered like translucent ghosts of the city. Her pulse quickened as a figure flickered at the far end of the anomaly. Half-formed but unmistakable, a silhouette she had seen countless times in the fractured edges of memory. Kale. She stepped forward, but a violent gravitational tug pulled everything sideways. The anomaly collapsed, folding inward. The Sentinel's voice boomed again. Closer now. Reconstruction imminent. Lina's surroundings warped into a bright vortex as she was pulled into the fracture point, her body dissolving into radiant shards of data, and then, for a heartbeat, everything went silent. The moment the chamber sealed behind her, Lina felt the air thin, like the world was holding its breath. The crystalline walls pulsed with a faint metallic heartbeat, echoing the last warning she had heard before the lights collapsed in episode 6C. A deep hum rose beneath her feet, resonating like the awakening of an ancient engine. She steadied herself, whispering a command that trembled out of her throat, only for the room to answer with a descending chime, and then a tearing sound, like fabric ripping through dimensions. A shaft of light spiraled downward, striking the floor with impossible precision, forming a rotating sigil she had never seen but instinctively feared. The temperature dropped. Her breath crystallized mid-air. Then the voice returned, not hostile, but coldly analytical, speaking her name as if indexing a flaw in a system. Lina stumbled backward as the sigil expanded, light rising like a column. A reflection shattered across 1,000 mirrored facets as unseen hands pulled gravity sideways. She reached out to stabilize herself, but the floor buckled into geometric folds. The hum became a roar. The chamber began rewriting itself. For one suspended moment, she saw a silhouette at the core of the light, human, familiar, impossible. Then the chamber detonated into silence again, swallowing the figure whole as the structure prepared to collapse around her. The chamber's collapsing geometry lunged inward, folding like metallic origami as Lina threw herself away from the imploding sigil, her body dragged sideways by the shifting gravitational vectors rippling through the crystalline air. The silhouette she had glimpsed inside the column of light flickered again, briefly, like a glitch in a cosmic transmission, before the walls fractured into razor-thin panes that spun around her with predatory precision. A thunderous crack tore through the chamber as the rotating sigil surged upward, expanding into a spiraling vortex that cast elongated shadows across the distortions, devouring the structure. Lina reached for the stabilizing beam that materialized beneath her hands, but it dissolved into iridescent dust, forcing her to brace against a surface that wasn't there a moment earlier. The vortex inhaled the dust and responded with a resonant pulse, and the silhouette stepped forward, its features still blurred, as though rendered by an incomplete memory. "Subject, return path compromised," it intoned, its voice layered with overlapping frequencies that vibrated against Lina's ribs. The chamber's floor split like cracked glass, revealing a void swirling with fractal storms far below. Lina tried to move, but the gravity shifted again, pulling her toward the widening fracture. The silhouette extended an arm, not a gesture of comfort, but calibration. A second pulse erupted, freezing the shards mid-spin, suspending the chamber in a fragile stasis. Then the vortex dimmed, leaving only the figure and its cold, analytical gaze fixed on her. "Override accepted," it whispered, the words rippling through the suspended fragments. The chamber stopped collapsing. The silence deepened, too deep, just before every shard around her turned to face her like thousands of reflective eyes. The suspended shards rotated toward Lina with synchronized precision, each mirror-like surface reflecting distorted fragments of her face, the chamber, and the faintly pulsing silhouette standing within the dimming vortex residue. A low hum spread through the stillness, not from machinery, but from the shards themselves, vibrating as though awakening to a single shared intention. Lina forced her breathing to steady, though the gravity remained unstable, tugging her weight in subtle diagonal shifts that threatened to tilt her off balance. The silhouette raised its hand, and the shards answered with a faint shimmer, aligning into layered concentric rings around her, forming what looked like a containment lattice encoded in light and crystal geometry. "Subject," the silhouette said in its multi-frequency voice. "Identity resonance incomplete. Initiating directive retrieval." A sudden pulse from the lattice flashed, illuminating her skin with thousands of micro-reflections. Lina felt a tug, not physical, but cognitive, like invisible fingers brushing through her memories. "Stop," she snapped, staggering backward, but the shards tightened their orbit, compressing the space around her. The silhouette tilted its head, analyzing her reaction with inhuman patience. Resistance detected. Compensating. The chamber darkened as the shards' glow intensified, forming spiraling patterns that spiraled inward like a hypnotic mandala. For a moment, Lina glimpsed inside the reflections, visions of herself standing in other rooms, other timelines, each one watching her back. A sudden sharp crack fractured the pattern. One shard, larger, darker, twitched out of formation, vibrating at a discordant frequency. The silhouette paused. Anomaly detected. The rogue shard darted toward Lina, hovering mere centimeters from her eyes, its surface swirling with data she could not read. The lattice shuddered. Another shard drifted out of alignment, then another. The silhouette surged forward, voice splitting into harsher frequencies. "Containment breach. Protocol escalation required." But before it could complete the command, the shards snapped toward each other, forming a spiraling cyclone around Lina like a crystalline tornado, lifting her off the fractured floor. The silhouette reached out, but the cyclone sealed shut, plunging Lina into a blinding rush of white light as the chamber's geometry collapsed outward in cascading waves. When the light vanished, she was gone. Lina's vision returned in fragments, first a smear of pale luminance, then the sensation of weightlessness dissolving into the cold kiss of solid ground beneath her palms. A dim corridor stretched ahead, its architecture rippling as though undecided on a single form, cycling between smooth metallic surfaces and porous stone textures that shifted with every blink of her eyes. The air hummed softly, like distant voices layered over an electromagnetic thrum. She exhaled shakily, realizing she was alone, no shards, no silhouette, no collapsing chamber, only the corridor, infinitely long and subtly breathing. When she took a step forward, the walls responded, extruding faint symbols that sparked in recognition of her movement before fading into darkness again. "Where am I?" she whispered, though her voice sounded strangely doubled, a faint echo of herself speaking a fraction of a second behind her. She froze. The echo didn't match her breath pattern. It repeated again, slightly altered, as if someone else was mimicking her voice from further down the hallway. She forced her hands still, shifting her stance. The corridor tightened around her, gently curving toward the right, pulling her forward as though gravity itself was giving subtle suggestions. Lina followed cautiously, every step casting new flickers of symbols across the walls. They grew more complex, forming spirals, branching lines, and fractal-like patterns that seemed to hover between meaning and chaos. The echo returned, clearer now. Where am I? It said again, but the tone carried a tremor she didn't recognize. Lina's pulse spiked. That wasn't an echo. That was someone else using her voice. A low vibration rippled through the floor, and the corridor shifted, splitting into 3 branching paths that unfolded like the petals of a metallic flower. Above each path, a faint silhouette flickered, each silhouette shaped like Lina but rendered in different states, one calm, one trembling, one staring directly at her with sharpened intensity. The trembling silhouette stepped forward, glitching slightly as though its frame rate were collapsing. "Choose," it whispered in her voice, but layered with static and a faint undertone she couldn't identify. The corridor walls flashed, and the path behind her sealed shut in a seamless fold of light and metal. The 3 paths pulsed in unison, waiting. Lina clenched her fists, inhaled, and stepped toward the intense version of herself, only for all 3 silhouettes to suddenly converge, merging into a single blinding outline that lunged toward her in a streak of fractured light. The merged silhouette crashed into Lina with a force like compressed lightning, sending her skidding across the shifting floor as the corridor warped to accommodate the impact, its walls rippling outward like a struck membrane. She gasped, bracing herself, but the light form was already reforming, its shape stabilizing into a distorted mirror of her own. Taller, sharper, with eyes hollowed into pulsing voids, it exhaled a vapor-like distortion that twisted the air around it. Lina pushed herself up, heartbeat thundering, and the floor beneath her responded, rising in jagged ridges that formed a protective arc. "You're not me," she said through clenched teeth, though the creature tilted its head with a mockingly slow curiosity. "I am the version you never allowed," it replied, its voice perfectly layered over hers, each syllable bending reality like a gravitational pulse. The corridor dimmed, funneling all ambient light into the creature's form, and suddenly the symbols etched along the walls began drifting toward it, threads of data, memories, possibilities siphoning into its core. Lina felt the pull in her own mind as old thoughts flickered at the edges of her vision. Choices she'd rejected, fears she'd buried, versions of herself that had never surfaced. The creature stepped forward, dragging the corridor with it as though the space itself bent to its will. Lina stumbled as another wave of psychic pressure pressed against her skull. "Stop," she hissed, gripping the nearest distortion ridge for balance. "You can't take what isn't yours." A fissure of light cracked along the floor, snaking outward and circling the 2 of them, sealing them within a glowing arena. The corridor beyond went utterly black, the creature's arms elongated, fracturing into blade-like tendrils that writhed with electric tension. Lina steadied her breath, forcing clarity into her thoughts. She summoned the memory constructs she'd learned to manipulate earlier, the shards of perception that had once nearly overwhelmed her, and for a moment, tiny points of luminescent focus sparked in her palms. The creature lunged. Lina countered, smashing the concentrated sparks against its tendrils, which shattered into pixels of scattered noise before reknitting themselves instantly. It hissed, tilting its head again, studying her like a puzzle. Then, without warning, it split into 2 parallel versions of itself, both advancing, both speaking her voice in overlapping stereo. "You cannot outpace what you abandoned." Lina's pulse spiked as she realized she was no longer fighting an enemy. She was fighting her unchosen future's given form. The arena tightened, and the 2 versions circled her like orbiting satellites preparing to collide. Lina froze as the chamber's luminous grid fractured into spiraling shards of violet static, each piece vibrating with a low, subsonic hum that crawled across her skin. The echo of the seer's last warning tangled in her chest as the fractured floor beneath her cracked further, revealing a shifting abyss of swirling data currents and ghost-like silhouettes reaching upward as if begging for release. Mara's voice, strained but steady, cut sharply through the rising distortion. "Stay with me, Lina." Even as her own outline flickered like a failing projection, the pulse node overhead brightened to a blinding white core, threads of energy snapping like electrified chains as the chamber's gravity twisted sideways, pulling Lina off balance and dragging her toward the glowing fault line expanding beneath her. She clawed at the air, feeling resistance like thick liquid as the abyss intensified, pulling harder, whispering with countless overlapping voices that spoke in forgotten harmonics, offering answers she had never asked for. A surge of force ripped through the chamber as Aiden slammed his palm against the stabilizer ring, its rusted metal igniting with golden circuitry that spidered outward and forced the collapsing grid to slow, but only for a moment. Lina felt the pull shift suddenly from her legs to her chest, yanking her forward as a spectral figure materialized within the abyss, mirroring her shape with unnerving precision, its eyes glowing with a cold and impossible intelligence. The figure extended its hand, and the entire world seemed to inhale sharply, space bending inward like a collapsing star. Mara lunged toward Lina, but the gravity distortion threw her sideways, pinning her against the fractured wall as shards of light cracked around her. Aiden shouted something, but the sound warped, stretching like melting metal. Lina reached instinctively toward the spectral reflection, only for another violent pulse to explode from the node, enveloping the chamber in a shockwave of iridescent light that sent her consciousness spiraling upward again, weightless, breathless, suspended between worlds as a chilling realization struck her. The figure had reached back. She was no longer being pulled, she was being chosen. Lina drifted in weightless suspension as the shockwave's fading luminescence thinned into a cool, pale shimmer, leaving her suspended in a boundless void where neither gravity nor direction seemed to exist. The spectral figure that had reached for her now hovered only a breath away, its outline rippling like liquid glass, its presence both impossibly familiar and disturbingly alien as it whispered through the silence without moving its lips, speaking in resonant chords that felt as though they vibrated through her bones, telling her she was standing at the threshold of the chosen recursion. Panic surged through her but dissolved instantly into a numb stillness as the void around her reshaped itself into a spiraling corridor of refracted memories, hers and not hers, shadows of childhood moments looping beside fragments of timelines she had never lived, each one flickering with prismatic distortion. Suddenly the corridor twisted violently, compressing into a narrow beam of blinding white as she felt something tug sharply at the center of her chest, pulling her forward with growing urgency. Behind her, the spectral figure extended an arm again, not to seize her but to steady her, and the moment its shimmering fingers grazed her shoulder, Lina felt a surge of clarity rush through her mind, unveiling a vision of the collapsing chamber where Mara screamed her name. Aiden slammed his weight against the failing stabilizer ring, and the fractured grid began to spiral inward as though preparing to implode. Lina gasped as the vision tore away, replaced by the sight of an enormous circular aperture forming ahead of her in the void, its edges crackling with violet lightning and its center swirling with fragments of data and shadowy silhouettes. The figure's voice echoed again, "Cross, or collapse follows," and as the aperture widened, a sudden jolt of force snapped through the void, sending shockwaves across the luminous expanse. Lina reached out instinctively, bracing herself against the distortion as the aperture erupted with a gust of energy that pulled her inexorably toward it. As she crossed its threshold, a deafening roar filled the void, and for an instant she felt every timeline, every memory, every possibility tearing across her consciousness before the world snapped abruptly into darkness and a cold metallic floor collided with her palms. She gasped, lifting her head just in time to see towering machinery rising around her in a cavernous chamber she had never seen. Lina pushed herself unsteadily to her feet, the cold metal beneath her palms still vibrating faintly as if the entire chamber were inhaling. Towering machines encircled her, each constructed of interlocking rings of matte black alloy etched with pulsing symbols that flickered like living circuitry, and as she turned slowly, she sensed an almost sentient awareness observing her from every angle. The spectral figure that had guided her into the void appeared again at the chamber's far end, its form stabilizing for the first time, sharpening into an elongated humanoid silhouette whose eyes glowed with a soft silver luminescence. When it spoke, the chamber responded, its walls reverberating with layered whispers as though echoing the memory of 1,000 voices, telling her that this place, called the Chamber of Recollection, had been built to store the timelines she had fractured, but also to guide the one who could mend them. Lina stepped closer as a central column ignited with cascading streams of data light, revealing holographic fragments of her life merging with scenes she had never witnessed, alternate versions of herself making choices she didn't remember choosing. Her breath shortened as she reached out tentatively, and the holograms surged toward her hand like a tide of translucent fire, enveloping her in a sudden rush of sensations: fear, triumph, regret, hope, each emotion layered from countless lives she might have lived. She staggered back, overwhelmed, as the spectral entity's voice rose in warning, urging her to anchor herself before the chamber overwhelmed her mind. Grasping for focus, Lina forced her thoughts into clarity, and the swirling holograms froze instantly, rearranging themselves into a single coherent strand of radiant golden code suspended before her. The figure explained that this strand represented the moment everything diverged, the first fracture that set all cascading consequences into motion, and that only by confronting the truth hidden there could she reclaim control of the collapsing timelines. With a deep breath, Lina reached toward the golden thread, bracing for impact, but before her fingers touched it, the chamber shuddered violently, alarms rippling across the walls as crimson light erupted overhead. The spectral figure stiffened, its form flickering, and shouted that someone, or something, was breaching the chamber from the outside. Lina spun toward the entrance as a colossal shadow formed beyond the sealed door, its silhouette stretching across the metallic floor, and for the first time since entering this place, she felt genuine dread coil tightly within her chest. The chamber's crimson alarms intensified, strobing violently across the towering machines as Lina instinctively stepped back from the sealed gate, her heartbeat sinking with the thunderous impacts reverberating through the metal. The spectral entity flickered erratically, its silver-lit eyes darting toward the widening fractures crawling across the gate's surface like glowing veins, warning her that whatever approached was not meant to exist within any stable timeline. Lina's pulse quickened as a low, guttural hum emanated from beyond the barrier, a vibration so deep it rattled the interlocking rings of the chamber's memory core constructs, and as she steadied her breath, the golden thread behind her flared with sudden intensity, as if reacting defensively to the imminent breach. She turned just in time to see its light splinter into a cascading halo that wrapped around her shoulders, the spectral entity shouting that the chamber itself had chosen to protect her. Recognizing her as the anchor capable of realigning its fractured time streams, the gate convulsed inward with explosive force, sending a shockwave of metallic shards skittering across the floor as a colossal silhouette stepped through. A creature wrought of shifting, obsidian plates, its shape constantly reconfiguring like broken mirror fragments trying to form a coherent body. Lina's breath caught as its faceless head pivoted toward her, a hollow resonance emanating from within its jagged frame, whispering not in words but in fragmented memories. Her memories, echoing versions of her own voice calling out in fear, confusion, anger. Fighting the instinct to retreat, she planted her feet firmly as the golden halo tightened around her, the spectral entity materializing beside her with renewed clarity, declaring the creature to be a temporal reclaimer, an entity born from collapsing timelines whose sole directive was to reclaim anomalies, including Lina. The creature lunged forward with a distortion that rippled the air like shattered glass, and Lina reacted instinctively, raising her hand as the golden halo expanded into a luminous shield that caught the creature's impact with a thunderous burst of radiant sparks. The chamber shook violently, machines whining under the temporal stress, while the reclaimer recoiled, its form glitching, but not retreating. Lina felt the strain of holding the shield, her muscles trembling, yet beneath the fear she sensed something new, a resonance, a matching frequency between her pulse and the chamber's living machinery, unlocking an instinctual understanding of how to channel the stored timeline's energy. As the reclaimer gathered itself for another assault, its obsidian plates rearranging into sharpened protrusions, Lina exhaled deeply, letting the halo's golden light flow down her arms, preparing to shape it not as a shield, but as a weapon. The spectral entity's voice rose above the alarms, urging her to act quickly, for the reclaimer's presence was destabilizing the chamber's core, and if she delayed even seconds longer, the entire memory complex, and every timeline connected to it, would collapse into irreversible darkness. The instant Lina redirected the golden halo from defense to intent, the chamber responded as if recognizing a long-suppressed command, its colossal rings slowing their chaotic rotation into a deliberate, synchronized rhythm that sent tremors of resonance through the floor beneath her feet. And as the temporal reclaimer reassembled itself from glitching obsidian fragments, Lina felt the timeline stored within the chamber brushing against her consciousness like distant echoes demanding release. She closed her eyes only for a heartbeat, long enough to sense the structure of the energy surrounding her, realizing it was not light but compressed memory given form, every pulse containing choices made and unmade, lives diverged and erased, and when she opened her eyes again, the golden flow had reshaped itself along her forearms into a concentrated, blade-like arc that hummed with unbearable pressure. The reclaimer reacted instantly, its massive form shifting into a predatory configuration as gravity distorted around it, pulling debris upward as if the chamber itself were being inverted. And Lina staggered but held her ground, her breath ragged as fragmented images flooded her mind. Visions of herself standing in ruined cities, drifting through frozen corridors of time, screaming into voids where no sound returned. Memories that were not hers alone but possibilities forcibly extracted by the creature now advancing toward her. The spectral entity shouted warnings she barely heard as the reclaimer's presence intensified, its hollow resonance amplifying until the air fractured with invisible cracks, and with each step it took, entire sequences of stored timelines collapsed into static, extinguished forever. Lina felt panic claw at her focus, yet beneath it burned a growing certainty that the weapon forming in her grasp was not meant to destroy but to realign, to cut through corrupted causality and restore coherence. And as she lifted her arm, the chamber's core flared blindingly bright, feeding energy into her with a force that threatened to tear her apart. She screamed, not in pain but in defiance, as the golden blade extended fully, its edge vibrating between moments, slicing milliseconds into fragments. And when the reclaimer lunged again, faster than before, Lina stepped forward instead of back, swinging the blade in a wide arc that did not strike flesh but time itself, causing the creature's forward motion to stutter violently as overlapping versions of its form collided and collapsed inward. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, machines screaming as alarms spiked, and Lina dropped to one knee, gasping as the energy recoiled through her body. Yet the reclaimer had been forced back, its obsidian mass unraveling into unstable shards that hovered uncertainly, no longer advancing but not yet defeated. Lina looked up through the haze, realizing with dawning clarity that this was only the beginning. That wielding remembered time demanded a price she had not yet paid, and as the chamber dimmed into an ominous half-light, she felt the golden blade tremble in her grip, as if anticipating the far more devastating choice that was rapidly approaching. The featureless corridor stretched endlessly ahead as the protagonist advanced with slow, controlled steps, their breath barely audible as the dim emergency lights sputtered overhead like dying stars struggling against the thick curtain of darkness. Each flicker cast elongated shadows across the metallic walls, briefly revealing the smeared handprints and deep gouges carved into the surface, as if something massive and desperate had scraped for escape. A low mechanical hum reverberated beneath the floor, growing stronger with every step, resonating like a pulse from the hidden machinery that seemed to sense the intruder's presence. As the protagonist approached the next junction, a faint whisper of distorted static crackled through the darkness, slipping around the edges of reality like a murmur from a broken radio trying to speak in forgotten languages. The protagonist paused, sensing the temperature drop as a cold current drifted through the hall, carrying the scent of metal, dust, and something faintly chemical. They reached out, fingertips grazing the wall, and felt it tremble ever so slightly, as if the entire structure was breathing, alive, and aware. A distant metallic clang echoed from the far end of the corridor, followed by the unmistakable scrape of heavy movement approaching, slow but deliberate. The emergency lights flickered violently, plunging the hall into strobing darkness that made the shadows dance like spectral figures convulsing in the half-light. The protagonist pressed onward, muscles tense, heart steady, their silhouettes slipping between the flashes as though navigating a world torn between existence and void. Rounding the corner, they found a shattered observation window overlooking a cavernous chamber below, flooded in red warning light that pulsed in rhythmic waves. Machinery the size of buildings moved like slumbering giants, their gears grinding in a mechanical lullaby that echoed in the hollow expanse. Electrical sparks rained from a severed conduit, the air vibrating with an oppressive energy that hinted at imminent collapse. The protagonist leaned forward, scanning the depths, catching sight of a vast circular platform in the center, its surface scorched, cables dangling like torn veins, and an immense machine at its core, dormant yet humming faintly, as though waiting for activation. But before they could study it further, the floor beneath them trembled, a deep rumble growing into a violent shudder as the corridor lights all burst simultaneously in a cascade of sizzling sparks. Everything went black, then a single thin beam of white light flickered to life behind them, cutting through the darkness like a scalpel. The protagonist froze. A slow, distorted breath emanated from the beam's direction, followed by a dragging step. Without turning, they sensed the presence inching closer, its form unseen yet heavy, radiating a cold pressure that wrapped around their spine. In one swift motion, the protagonist slipped away from the light, moving down the side path as alarms erupted across the facility, the klaxons wailing in broken, glitching intervals. Doors slammed shut in rapid succession, metallic thunder echoing as though the entire structure was sealing itself, trapping them within a labyrinth designed to erase intruders. With each step the protagonist took, the air vibrated with deeper resonance, the unseen presence following relentlessly, its distorted breath weaving through the chaos like a whisper from the void. Ahead, a circular hatch began to close, grinding slowly. The protagonist lunged forward, sliding beneath it just as it slammed down behind them with a force that shook the floor. They rose into a cavernous tunnel illuminated only by a distant, faint crimson glow, the hum of the massive machine now echoing louder, calling them deeper. And then, as the darkness swallowed the corridor behind them, they realized the presence had not been blocked at all. The sound of its dragging steps echoed from the newly sealed chamber, coming closer, its pace accelerating as though it had finally found the path it wanted. The relentless echo of the approaching steps grew sharper in the vast tunnel as the protagonist pressed forward, the crimson glow ahead pulsing like a heartbeat that pulled them deeper with every breath. The air thickened with heat and metallic dust, vibrating faintly as the unseen presence behind them accelerated with newfound certainty, its distorted breathing swelling into a rasping cadence that crawled across the floor like a living shadow. The protagonist slipped into a low jog, boots striking the grated path with hollow rhythm, each impact echoing through the cylindrical chamber like signals bounced between steel ribs of some colossal beast. As they advanced, the crimson light intensified, revealing towering pipes that curved along the walls like skeletal archways, steam venting from their joints in heavy bursts that fogged the air into shifting curtains of red mist. A sudden tremor rattled the tunnel, followed by a thunderous clang behind them as the sealed hatch, the one they had narrowly slid under, began to warp inward, as if struck repeatedly by something massive. The metal groaned in protest, hinges twisting, bolts snapping one by one, each break echoing like gunshots. The protagonist didn't look back. They could feel the vibrations through the floor, the shuddering resonance of something tearing its way through barriers not meant to be breached. Ahead, a platform emerged from the darkness, an elevated walkway suspended over a yawning pit illuminated by the glow of molten machinery below. Rivers of red-hot coolant flowed like luminous lava veins, casting violent ripples of light across the steel surfaces. As the protagonist stepped onto the walkway, a deep roar reverberated behind them as the hatch finally gave way, exploding outward in a storm of twisted metal that clattered across the tunnel. The presence surged into the open, its heavy, dragging steps transforming into a powerful stride that pounded against the grated floor, sending vibrations trembling up through the protagonist's legs. They accelerated, pushing deeper across the catwalk as the heat beneath intensified, sweat forming instantly, the air shimmering like liquid fire. The walkway trembled, and sparks from the surrounding machinery fell like bright embers raining from an unseen forge. Halfway across, a mechanical arm the size of a locomotive lurched to life below, swinging in a wide arc as though reacting to the protagonist's proximity. The force of its movement sent a blast of scorching air upward, nearly knocking them off balance. They steadied themselves, gripping the railing just long enough to regain footing, only to hear the metallic thunder of the presence stepping onto the walkway behind them. The structure groaned under the combined weight, the grated panels flexing dangerously. The protagonist pushed forward, but then the entire walkway shuddered violently as a segment behind them collapsed, plunging into the glowing chasm with a hiss of evaporating coolant. The presence leapt forward, its landing shaking the beam like an earthquake, still on their trail. With the path collapsing piece by piece, the protagonist forced themselves into a sprint, the metal beneath them cracking and screaming with each step. Ahead, an arched doorway flickered with intermittent white light, a failing energy barrier, its protective field sputtering like a dying signal. The protagonist lunged toward it, feeling the heat blister against their clothes as another massive section of the walkway gave way behind them. They dove through the barrier just as it sparked violently, the field collapsing in a shower of electric arcs that lit the chamber in blinding flashes. The moment the protagonist hit the floor on the other side, a thunderous crash sounded behind them as the walkway finally tore free and fell entirely into the molten machinery below, dragging everything, including the path the presence had been following, into the abyss. Silence followed for only a heartbeat. Then a sound rose from the pit, a low, resonant rumble, not of defeat but of something climbing, something adapting, something far from finished. Before the protagonist could process it, the walls around them shifted with a grinding roar as new panels slid open, revealing a descending spiral stairway carved into the depths of the structure, illuminated solely by a distant, throbbing red light. With the unseen presence still re-emerging from the abyss and the facility reshaping itself yet again, the protagonists tightened their grip on the railing and began the descent into the red-lit spiral, uncertain of what waited below but knowing hesitation meant annihilation. The protagonist descended the spiraling metal staircase with each step echoing into the cavernous depths, the red glow beneath intensifying like a pulsing wound in the earth as the air grew hotter, thicker, and saturated with the low mechanical hum of unseen machinery awakening in distant layers below. Their hand tightened on the railing, feeling the vibration of shifting plates through the cold metal, as the entire structure seemed to adjust to their presence, as if some dormant intelligence were tracking their movements from within the walls themselves. And yet they continued downward, aware that the monstrous presence behind them, whatever had survived the molten fall, would inevitably find another path. The staircase stretched endlessly, coils of steel vanishing into the crimson haze, the railing damp with condensation that smelled faintly of iron and heated oil, every droplet catching the red luminance and scattering it into trembling reflections that danced along the character's silhouette. As they descended further, the omnipresent hum deepened into a resonant thrum, punctuated by rhythmic metallic knocks that sounded almost like a heartbeat, and soon the protagonists realized the steps were no longer stationary. They vibrated beneath their boots like an enormous engine turning over beneath the floor, a mechanical titan awakening after years of burial. The red glow surged brighter in a sudden pulse that washed the staircase in harsh light, revealing shifting shadows along the walls, shadows that did not match the protagonist's movements, shadows that flickered in unnatural directions, stretching and retracting like the limbs of some unseen creatures watching from behind the metallic curvature. Instinctively, the protagonist quickened their pace, moving deeper into the spiraling descent until the staircase abruptly opened into a massive circular chamber suspended over an abyss so deep its bottom was lost to the darkness below, broken only by sporadic pulses of red light that illuminated colossal pistons rising and falling like the breathing lungs of a giant machine. A narrow walkway extended from the stairs end toward a central platform, and as the protagonist stepped onto it, the floor beneath them trembled with a sudden jolt as a deep vibration traveled upward through the abyss, shaking the entire chamber. Dust drifted from high above like falling ash, illuminated only when the red light surged again, and in that harsh illumination the protagonist saw movement across the chamber, panels sliding open far along the walls, exposing vast mechanical limbs retracting into the darkness, as if the structure itself were repositioning in anticipation of their arrival. The walkway groaned under their weight with every step, the metal warped and aged, and below, the pistons slammed downward with a thunderous force that sent rushing columns of hot air upward like the breath of a furnace. The protagonist reached the central platform just as the entire chamber shuddered violently. Gears the size of buildings rotated deep within the walls, and an immense cylindrical column began rising from the abyss, its surface lined with glowing sigils like patterns etched into the shell of some ancient monolith. The monolith locked into place with a seismic clang that echoed upward into the chamber, and as the protagonist circled it cautiously, its sigils began to rotate, each symbol aligning with the next in a sequence that radiated heat and pulsing light. Suddenly, the sigils froze mid-rotation, and a deep rumble emanated from within the monolith as a single panel slid open, releasing a rush of scorching air and revealing an interior chamber filled with dense red mist. The protagonist hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside, the metal landing beneath them shifting as though adjusting to their weight, sealing the entrance behind them with a heavy metallic thud. Inside, the space was impossibly large, its walls curving outward into a cathedral-like expanse filled with towering machinery that rose from floor to ceiling like massive mechanical organs, their surfaces pulsating with red energy that cast shifting shadows across the character's featureless silhouette. As the protagonist ventured deeper, a low resonance filled the space, a voice-like vibration that was neither mechanical nor organic but a merging of both, and as it echoed through the chamber, the floor began to move, lifting them upward on a rising platform. The red mist thinned as they ascended, revealing a central core suspended in midair by spiraling energy conduits that wrapped around it like glowing serpents. The core pulsed once, slow, deliberate, almost sentient, and in that instant, the protagonist felt something brush against their mind, a distant whisper, a memory not their own, an ancient warning echoing through the machinery as the chamber sealed itself entirely and the ascent accelerated toward a destination unseen. As the platform steadied, the core's slow pulse synchronized with the protagonist's own ragged breath, and in that synchronization a corridor of memory unspooled before their inner eye, fractured scenes stitched in a trembling montage, hands they did not remember gripping cold metal, a child's laugh that desynchronized into static, a laboratory where faces hovered like wet portraits and then evaporated. The core's conduits thrummed with responses, each coil translating those borrowed images into a language of pressure and light against the skull. And the protagonist realized the chamber did not simply store history, it curated possibility, running simulations of lives that might have been to find one that could mend the rupture. A low harmonic rose from the core, not sound but a felt frequency that opened a corridor of decisions inside their mind, and somewhere far below the whine of pistons the monstrous presence that had pursued them scraped and adapted. Seeking a way through the reconfigured architecture, they stepped closer to the pulsing heart, feeling the metal beneath their boots warm as if the machine regarded them with curious patience, then reached out, fingertips trembling, to brush the surface of the core, and at that touch a rush of vertiginous information poured through them, floods of timelines collapsing and reconciling like rivers meeting at a confluence, names and faces folding into one another, until meaning cohered into the shape of a single choice. A metallic whisper threaded through the resonance, half language, half command, choose an axis, sacrifice an echo, allow coherence or preserve the fractal plurality, each option unfurling consequences that glittered like shards of light, and the protagonist felt the gravity of every discarded possibility as if each were a bone to be carried. They sensed, with clarifying dread, that wielding the core's alignment would not merely rebalance a machine, but prune entire branches of existence, excising selves and futures to bind the world back to a single, stable thread. Their hands tightened on the core as visions flared of loved ones saved in one timeline but erased in another, of cities that would live and die differently, depending on which memory they prioritized, and the monstrous reclaimer's distant roar grew in resonance, as if the entity could feel the pruning from afar and rush to reclaim those threads before the cut was final. Urgency molten in their chest, the protagonist drew a slow breath and accepted that choice would demand a cost. That restoration meant loss. And with resolve sharpened by the coldness of inevitability, they lifted a single hand and traced the pattern of a sigil across the conduit, a practiced motion that drew the core's energy into a narrow spine of light, an axis of selection, and as it rose, the chamber convulsed, conduits flaring like excised veins, the monolith's sigils aligning into a blade of calibrated memory that hummed with exacting purpose. A sudden jolt rocked the platform as the reclaimer breached a lower gate, its shadow lashing up the shaft in a terrible, reconstituted stride, and alarms bled through the red mist while the core's blade steadied in the protagonist's grip, humming with the weight of severed possibilities. With only a sliver of time, they angled the blade and severed a single shimmering strand that shimmered with an image of a future where someone they cared for survived. And the clean cut rang through the chamber like a bell. Instant silence followed by a falling away sensation, as if a storm had been clipped mid-breath. The reclaimer howled in a soundless rupture that translated into the chamber as tearing light, and for a heartbeat the world held between two breaths, the chosen axis humming, the cost settling like a lead weight in the protagonist's gut. When the platform descended again into the red-stitched labyrinth below, the conduits had stilled, the monolith dimmed to a patient rumble, and the protagonist knew in that hollow quiet that the machine had accepted their choice. But acceptance was not ending. Somewhere beyond the sealed doors, the shape of what had been severed had already begun to fade. Echoes of its laughter snuffed from the patterning of the world, and the protagonist, blade still warm in their hands, stepped forward into the stairwell that opened toward the facility's heart, bearing a new, thinner truth and the latent knowledge that every writing would demand another wound. As the protagonist stepped into the dim stairwell that unfolded from the monolith's shifting plates, the red glow behind them faded into a smoldering gloom that pulsed in sync with the lingering vibration of the severed strand, and the blade of condensed memory in their hand dimmed from a searing radiance to a muted ember as though mourning the echo that had been cut away. The metal corridor ahead descended in twisting arcs, its walls puckered and warped as if reshaped by immense internal pressure, every surface alive with faint tremors that whispered through the steel like the aftershock of a suppressed scream. And with each cautious step the protagonist felt the world adjusting, fragments of the pruned timeline dissolving from reality's periphery like forgotten dreams slipping beyond recall, alarms muttered in distant chambers as automated systems recalibrated, the facility's architecture flexing and tightening around fresh parameters. And somewhere far below the reclaimer's frustration reverberated through the structure, an agonized pulse of displaced hunger, the creature struggling to reconcile its pursuit with the sudden absence of the timeline it fed upon. As the protagonist rounded the next curve, the corridor dropped sharply into a cavernous hall lined with obsidian panels that flickered with ghost-like afterimages of people who no longer existed. Silhouettes caught mid-motion before shattering into drifting red particles that evaporated into the stale air, and for a moment the protagonist stood frozen, their breath hitching as the apparition of a familiar figure, someone the severed axis had erased, lifted an arm as if to speak before collapsing into crystalline dust. The weight of choice settled heavily on their shoulders, a hollow ache blooming in their chest that made the silence feel carnivorous, yet the platform beneath their feet murmured insistently, urging them onward along a path now altered by their selection. They pressed forward through the hall as the obsidian panels grew brighter, projecting half-formed vistas of alternative possibilities like memories fighting extinction, cities of spiraling glass folding inward, dim corridors where the protagonist moved with different scars, different burdens, all dissolving into static as the severed echo faded completely. A resonant hum suddenly rippled through the hall like a warning rippled across water, and vents along the ceiling snapped open to exhale ribbons of red vapor that twisted downward in serpentine patterns, coiling around the protagonist's silhouette with gentle, almost searching caresses, as though the facility's central intelligence were assessing the newly aligned reality and cross-checking them against its surviving reference points. The blade pulsed weakly in their hand, responding to unseen pressure, and a narrow pathway lit beneath their boots, drawing them toward a towering blast door whose structure throbbed with interlocking gears and molten conduits, each rotation sounding like a heartbeat stretched across metal. As they approached, the door peeled open with a groaning metallic sigh, revealing a colossal chamber in which a suspended lattice of energy, like a fractured globe of red lightning, thrashed against containment rings, its arcs snapping violently at the air as if tasting for weakness. The protagonist recognized it instinctively as the stabilization node, the very mechanism that governed the interplay of preserved and pruned timelines, and as they stepped onto the catwalk spiraling toward it, the node reacted, contracting its lightning into a focused beam that swept across the chamber and struck the protagonist with a probing flare of heatless force. Their vision fractured into a mosaic of overlapping realities, themselves standing on different catwalks, themselves holding no blade, themselves screaming into collapsing voids. And in each version the node's judgment weighed differently until finally the mosaic snapped back into a single thread, the one they had chosen, and the beam receded with an almost mournful whine. Abruptly the chamber lurched as the machinery below roared to life, and the node's containment rings dipped and spun, revealing a widening crack between two arcs of energy where something massive was forcing its way upward from the depths. the air vibrating with a predatory resonance that scraped along the protagonist's nerves like claws of sound. A shadow rose through the crack, its shape rippling as though stitched from molten darkness, and with a guttural, grinding exhale the reclaimer's upper form heaved into view, its body reconstituted from fractured memory shards that glimmered angrily as it sensed the protagonist's living alignment. The catwalk trembled as the beast hauled itself higher, its limbs reshaping with each movement, adapting to the recalibrated physics of the severed world. And the protagonist tightened their grip on the fading blade, realizing with icy clarity that the creature had not been weakened by the pruning, only enraged, sharpened, and driven into a singularity of intent. As the chamber's containment alarm spiraled into a frantic wail, the node's lightning lashed wildly in panicked arcs, its unstable energy reacting to the reclaimer's intrusion, and the protagonist took a steadying breath, stepping forward as the catwalk groaned beneath them, readying themselves for the confrontation the severed echo had demanded, knowing that their next choice would not rewrite timelines, but determine whether the one thread they had left would survive at all. The protagonists braced themselves against the trembling catwalk as the reclaimer's molten, obsidian-streaked bulk forced its way farther through the fractured containment rings, each ponderous pull of its jagged limbs releasing a shower of red-lit shards that hissed like burning embers when they struck the metal below. And as the stabilization node's lightning lattice convulsed around the intrusion, reality itself began to stutter in rapid oscillations that warped the air with nauseating ripples. The protagonist advanced despite the violent tremors, gripping the dimming memory blade as if it were the last remnant of a fading world, its weakened glow flickering in discordant pulses that matched the instability of the severed timeline surrounding them. And with each step the catwalk twisted subtly underfoot, its structural supports reconfiguring in frantic attempts to compensate for the gravitational distortions the reclaimer's presence generated. The creature's head, if it could be called that, began to form from swirling masses of molten darkness, its contours shifting between angular metallic masks and skeletal voids, as though it could not settle on a stable shape within the newly pruned reality, and a guttural vibration rumbled through its torso, an inhuman approximation of cognition as it oriented its gaze toward the protagonist, recognizing them not merely as prey, but as the architect of its deprivation. The node's containment rings, strained beyond design, rotated in desperate, flickering jerks, their arcs of lightning lashing uncontrollably at the rising beast, searing deep welts into its molten hide. Yet the creature only grew more massive, absorbing the energy into its internal fractures where faint echoes, voices from erased timelines, whispered like distant screams trapped inside solid stone. The protagonist lunged forward along the spiraling path as the reclaimer reached one colossal arm toward the catwalk, its claws elongating into bladed protrusions that cut through the air with a metallic shriek, and the swipe narrowly missed them by inches, leaving a distorted wake in space that cracked open into a brief fissure of void before sealing shut. The protagonist used the catwalk's momentary recoil as leverage to sprint closer to the node's core, knowing that the structure's destabilization was both a threat and an opportunity. Because if the node collapsed while the reclaimer was halfway through the containment breach, the implosion might rip the creature apart, or else rupture the entire facility into cascading dimensional collapse. As the protagonist neared the central interface, a series of holographic glyphs erupted from the platform like luminous shards of ancient script, their geometry shifting in frantic permutations that reflected the chaos of a system trying to predict impossible outcomes. And when they extended a hand toward the swirling cluster, the glyphs halted abruptly as if startled, realigning into a coherent but ominously incomplete sequence awaiting a final command. Behind them the reclaimer bellowed, a colossal roar wrought from the tortured resonance of overlapping timelines, its fury shaking the catwalk and dislodging entire panels from the chamber's walls, which plummeted into the abyss with echoing crashes swallowed immediately by the thrashing lightning below. The protagonist touched the nearest glyph, and the node responded with a thunderous pulse that hurled a shockwave outward, momentarily halting the reclaimer's ascent as tendrils of pure energy wrapped around its limbs. Yet the creature strained forward with titanic determination, its molten form cracking open to reveal an inner core of spiraling darkness that writhed like a nest of serpents composed of shadow and memory. Winds surged violently through the chamber as gravitational anchors buckled, pulling debris, shards of metal, sparks, and disintegrating matter into chaotic vortexes spinning around the node center, and the protagonists steadied themselves against the interface column, forcing their focus onto the incomplete glyph sequence that flickered insistently, waiting for them to push it into a finalized command. The memory blade flickered in their grip, reacting to the node's growing instability, as if urging them toward a decision that would shape the fate of the last surviving thread of reality. And as the reclaimer tore free from several of the energy tendrils restraining it, It hurled its immense bulk forward in one final, catastrophic lunge toward the protagonist. Time seemed to dilate into slow motion as the creature's molten claws slashed downward, and the node's lightning reached violently upward in a desperate, instinctive defense, forming a barrier of explosive white-red radiance, but the protagonist knew the barrier would not hold. Their hand hovered over the final glyph. Understanding that initiating the override would either force the node to collapse inward, consuming everything within the chamber, including themselves and, hopefully, the reclaimer, or stabilize the timeline at the cost of permanently binding the creature to the new reality, ensuring that this nightmare would persist indefinitely. Breath steady but heartbeat thunderous, they brought their hand down toward the glyph just as the reclaimer's claws breached the barrier, and the chamber erupted into a blinding burst of red and white light, the outcome suspended in a single, cataclysmic instant that would decide the survival of the last thread remaining. As the chamber's trembling floor settled beneath her feet, Lina felt the aftershocks of the unseen pulse reverberate through her bones, and before she could brace herself against the spiraling dizziness clawing at the edges of her vision, the shuddering glow that had erupted across the walls in the final instant of Part 79 began to twist, coil, and compress into a single vertical fissure of blinding white that seemed to breathe like a living organism, its edges rippling with static as if the fracture in reality itself were struggling to remain open. She staggered backward, boots scraping against the cold stone, her hand instinctively tightening around the fabric of her coat, and though she could not see her own face in the shimmering reflections of the shifting walls, she felt it, the unmistakable pull of something ancient, intelligent, and hungry observing her from beyond that radiant tier, its presence pressing against her consciousness with the weight of an ocean as whispers bled through the crack like thin strands of smoke, drifting toward her in spirals of indecipherable syllables that vibrated beneath her skin. She tried to ground herself by focusing on the rhythmic hum of her own breath, but even that began to distort, echoing strangely as though she were breathing inside someone else's memory. And with each passing second, the fissure widened, exhaling waves of heat and cold in alternating pulses that made the chamber feel like a lung expanding and contracting around her. The patterns etched into the floor, those same markings that had only moments ago reconfigured themselves in response to her presence, began to glow in synchronized pulses, stretching outward like roots seeking nourishment, crawling toward the fracture as if drawn to its impossible light. And Lina watched with growing alarm as the chamber itself responded, its architecture shifting, arching, and twisting like a great mechanical ribcage awakening from centuries of slumber. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, because she recognized, instinctively, undeniably, that this was not a doorway opening for her, but a reaction to her, the chamber reading her as a catalyst rather than a visitor. And as the humming intensified into a resonant frequency that made her teeth vibrate, she felt the ground beneath her feet tilt ever so slightly, realigning the angle of the room around a point of focus that had not existed seconds before. Then a sound, subtle yet piercing, slipped through the widening fracture, a harmonic tone that carried with it a dripping sense of familiarity, a reminder of the voice that had guided her through darkness in the earliest stages of her descent. And the moment she recognized it, the light convulsed violently, ejecting a shock wave of luminous particles that engulfed the chamber in a cascading storm of brilliance. She shielded her eyes, though the radiance penetrated her closed lids, and when the brilliance dimmed just enough for her to see through the haze, she caught a glimpse of a shape forming within the fracture's core, a tall, elongated silhouette with no distinct features, its entire body swathed in roiling shadow that flickered like ink suspended in water, its outline stretching and contracting as if struggling to maintain coherence in this plane. Lina's breath caught as the silhouette extended an arm, a limb made of darkness and refracted light, and though it never touched her, she felt the intentionally behind the gesture, an invitation and a warning fused together. The chamber's walls responded immediately, their shifting latticework freezing for the first time since the pulse began, locking in place as if awaiting her decision, and Lina sensed that whatever happened next would either bind her fate irrevocably to the entity beyond the fracture or sever her path entirely. The fissure crackled again, widening with a sound like splitting stone, and the silhouette leaned forward, its form unraveling in strands of shadow that drifted toward her like reaching hands, and as each strand neared her skin, she felt memories that were not her own flicker through her mind, visions of barren landscapes, spiraling monoliths, and a towering machine that pierced the clouds, and the sudden weight of those visions made her knees buckle. She forced herself upright, struggling against the oppressive gravity of the presence, knowing instinctively that stepping back would be read as rejection and stepping forward would be read as acceptance, each choice irrevocably altering the path she was trapped within. The light pulsed once more, and the silhouette's head tilted in a motion too precise, too deliberate to be accidental, and for the briefest heartbeat, Lina felt the chamber itself holding its breath around her. Then, in a single decisive motion, she extended her hand toward the drifting strands of shadow, her fingers trembling as the entity's tendrils of darkness wrapped around her palm like cold metal wires, and the moment contact was made, a violent surge of energy erupted through her body, consuming her vision in a blinding flash as the fracture snapped fully open, and the world shattered into cascading layers of light and void. That wraps up our analysis of the severed echo in episode 4. But the discussion is just beginning. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the new entity from the blinding fissure is an ally or an even greater enemy than the Reclaimer? Drop your theories in the comments below, and let's discuss it. If you found this breakdown insightful, please smash that like button, it helps tremendously. And to continue the journey, click on episode 5, the next title, showing on your screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next deep dive.